I'm Amy Buckland. I'm the Institutional Repository Librarian here. And the afternoon's going to be good. I know we're all hitting that post-lunch dip. But Heather has promised she's going to dance at some point, so we're good. We'll be fine. There's so much food in the back. Please help yourself. So I'll do a quick intro and then we'll let Heather get started. So Heather serves as the Executive Director of the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, SPARC, an international coalition of academic and research libraries working to expand the global digital communication of research results. She leads the strategic and operational activities of the organization and has focused SPARC's efforts on supporting emerging communications models for digital articles, data, and educational resources. Prior to joining SPARC, she spent 15 years as a publishing executive in both commercial and not-for-profit organizations, including as publishing director at the American Society for Cell Biology, and she was very involved in PubMed Central. You're a busy lady. No, I want to tell them this one, though. This is good. Heather serves on the board of directors of a number of nonprofits, including the Public Library of Science, DuraSpace, and Impact Story. She's an active participant in projects and committees at several U.S. federal science agencies and was recently appointed to serve on the U.S. Secretary of Commerce's Data Advisory Council. She's a frequent speaker. This is her 4th talk this week, and we're very lucky to have her. So please come up, Heather.
For Amy, I'll dance. I'll just say that. You guys really don't need to see it, but maybe I will. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and including me in this wonderful seminar. I'm really, really delighted to be here today, and I promise that despite the fact that this says the evolving policy environment for research outputs, I'll try not to make it as god-awful boring as I just realized that title makes it sound. It's really an exciting topic and a very dynamic environment. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to share with you some insights that we've been able to glean from our perch at SPARC, kind of watching and helping to maybe encourage policy development here in the United States. So I just wanted to open by saying I recognize that this talk has a very US-centric focus in the policy environment, and that was deliberate so that I could keep this focus to under 45 minutes. But I will try to bring in the trends that are emerging, or to try to show how the trends that are emerging in the United States are not happening in isolation, but rather are being amplified and are amplifying trends that are happening outside the United States and also outside of U.S. public research funders in the private funding sector. So no secret to anybody that the policy environment has been moving, placing a larger emphasis on thinking about how open as a strategy can be used in the policy environment to both help us solve large problems and also to serve as a lever to create new opportunities. And I think one of the most common misconceptions that we hear is that the open access movement kind of came upon this idea of creating open policies or open access policies to research results. And what I want to try to show you in this talk is that nothing could really be farther from the truth. And I'll break this up into 4 sections. So first, I want to talk just very briefly about the drivers in the policy environment that have long existed, that have led towards this movement towards policies to open up access to articles, to data, to research results, but to information in general. Point to some precedent that we have in the U.S. policy environment that laid the groundwork, including actually giving us language that we're using today in open access policies. Talk about a couple of exemplar policies in the data and the article environment that have kind of served as benchmarks and really sort of landmark landmark events in the policy environment, and then close by talking about what's going on right now in U.S. federal agencies with the plans that are emerging from, right now we have, I think, 12 of the 19 agencies that were required to produce new plans for policies to open up access to their results. And I as I said yesterday when I gave an overview of this, my original plan was to go through each policy in detail and give you, all the ins and outs of each policy. But then I realized maybe you do, but you didn't really need a 45-minute nap. So instead, I'll just pull out some of the highlights in terms of the trends that are evolving that we need to keep an eye on as a community. So in terms of drivers, right, I think it's a very simple argument that has existed for quite some time. And it's really a basic return on investment argument that research funders, particularly public research funders, have used, right? Annually, funders invest tens of billions of dollars into basic and applied research. In the United States, it's upwards of $60 billion a year annually invested into the research environment. And they do it for a reason, right? They invest this on behalf of taxpayers with the expectations that good things are going to happen for the public, that new ideas will be generated, that will accelerate discoveries, and that our collective understanding of the world will be enhanced, and our interactions in the world will also be enhanced. But they also recognize, right, that Cameron's talk is kind of a nice setup for this, right, in thinking about what's generated as a result of research. Right? This can only happen if the outputs of research, the articles, the data, the ideas, the knowledge that are contained in those results can be accessed and readily used by people to be understood and, frankly, built upon. So the working theory, right, the driver behind open access policies that has evolved is that policies that encourage the widest possible access and utility of these research outputs to the widest possible audience will have the best chance of accelerating and significantly improving these outcomes. And this is something we've been talking a lot about, and we were talking at lunch about this notion that sometimes we tend to talk in the open environment or open access environment about trying to achieve open for open's sake, right? Because open is better than closed, right? Open is a good thing. But actually, it's these outcomes. It's the fact that we want to open up access in order to solve big problems that are facing us, right? Capitalize on big opportunities that's the drivers really behind why people work so hard for these policies to be put into place. And the outcomes, again, right, are they're not theoretical. They're things that have an impact on our daily lives, right? Getting new ideas out there, speeding up the pace of discovery, improving educational outcomes, right? Creating lower cost resources so that people can afford to use learning materials and teaching materials in schools, fueling innovation, growing the economy, and creating jobs. Again, not theoretical, right? Amy mentioned that I have had the incredible privilege of being appointed to the Secretary of Commerce's first ever data advisory committee. And I'm on this committee with 18 people, 15 of whom are representatives from some of the largest companies in the United States. And they range from blue chips like Intel and GE and IBM to companies that were actually created based on the use of openly available public data. So if you've ever used an app to look for a house called Zillow, think about the fact that what you're looking at when you look at Zillow is, I want to know what neighborhood I'm in, but I also want to know something about the school system. I want to know something about the tax base. I want to know if I'm in a floodplain. I want to know if I'm in an earthquake zone. All of the data that Zillow uses to feed into that app is collected from publicly available U.S. funded data sources. So this is an enormous revenue and job generating business built on data. Some of it's research data, some of it is more sort of consumer-oriented data, but it's data nonetheless. So this idea of growing the economy and creating jobs by opening up these results is way more than theoretical. And in general, the end game, right, that we're working towards with these policies is to make things better for us as individuals, to have an effect on people in their daily lives. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of precedent, right? The open access movement, the open data movement didn't come up with language for open access policies or even the idea for open access policies out of thin air. We've got a ton of examples in existing U.S. information policy that have paved the way to help us create a strong foundation that's supportive of a culture of open sharing of information, of government information in particular, of federally funded information in specific. And they range, I can see you guys are looking at this, you're going, oh my God, she's gonna go through every single one of these things and tell us what they say. Yes, no, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. It's just important to understand that there is this foundational effort from the Copyright Act, which has some good things in it as well as some, stuff we all know that we don't like. But by the way, as you all know, coming to a Congress near you this year is a new push for copyright reform. They're starting in earnest. There's a new coalition that's actually being formed that the library community, the academic community, some freedom of information groups, as well as some commercial groups are getting together in a preemptive way to begin to form a coalition so that when copyright reform does hit in earnest, we're able to hopefully speak a little bit more effectively with multiple voices going through one channel for the kinds of things we would like to see in it. But the Copyright Act actually gives us language that's helpful in terms of setting some benchmarks for opening up access to information. FOIA, the Paperwork Reduction Act, I mean, they all sound like they might not necessarily be perfect, but they are laying foundational principles that are important. And the one that's the most important and the one that I want to highlight is the one that sounds most innocuous, right? The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB Circular A130. And A130 talks about government information and what the parameters should be for public access and public use of government information. And this again was I don't have a date on it, but this is actually a 1990s regulation. The statute says specifically that government information is a valuable national resource and that the economic benefits to society, right, to the public, can only be maximized when that information is available in a timely manner and in an equitable manner to all. And they further go on to define what does that mean. It means open and unrestricted access to public information, to all government information. This includes the data that the government generates, and it includes research data and article data, as we'll see in policy evolution, at no more than the cost of disseminating that information. That's a hugely important foundational piece of regulatory language and policy language that we've had in place for decades that has allowed us to build a culture where there is not an expectation that the federal government commercializes the information that it produces out of our federal tax dollars. We've also had the benefit of having an administration that has specifically prioritized open for the past 6 years and change. And this hasn't been a small thing. I think some of the activities that have gone on and some of the policy products that have gone on have kind of fallen not on deaf ears, but I think it bears a cumulative look back to kind of say, okay, so we have these great statements, we have these little pieces of regulation, we've got a direction that we're pointed in that should be moving the needle towards open sharing of this information. Why aren't we there yet? And I think that is a question that this administration asked prior to taking up the reins in the White House and was prepared to hit the ground running on. When the Obama administration took the Oval Office, when the president took the Oval Office in 2009, his very first action on his very first day in office was to issue something called the Open Government Directive. And this was a hugely broad and aspirational sweeping directive that laid out new expectations from his perspective as the President of the United States and his administration's perspective for openness and transparency in all government activities and for openness and transparencies in all government outputs, including information and data produced by the federal government. And that was huge, right? And simply issuing something called an Open Government Directive set the tone and set the expectation bar quite high. But I think what we saw as the public was the one real visual representation of this directive was the establishment of data.gov. And you can say what you will about data.gov, and there's much that we can say about data.gov for those of you who are familiar with it. The initial tiny dipping our toe in the water of requiring government data and information to be made available was the section in this directive that established this website as essentially a clearinghouse for high-value data sets produced by federal agencies. And each federal agency was asked to simply identify 3 data sets that they deemed high value and put them in open and machine-readable form and make them available to the public through the data.gov website. And that sounds to us, I think, in 2015 like, man, that's just a tiny little timid step forward. And certainly the I don't have that slide in this deck. Sorry. Certainly the results of what agencies deemed high value data sets that went up initially on data.gov came under a lot of criticism. I do have a slide, it's not in this deck, unfortunately, that shows one of the most heavily hit data sets, high value data sets on data.gov for the first 2 years it was up, was the White House visitors log. Right? So it's who came to the White House to visit who at what time. And if you're a Yenta like me and you're nosy and you want to be in people's business, it was fantastic. It was this great resource. In terms of high value to generating return to the public, not really sure, what was there. But the notion was this, right? The expectations were, we're going to have to, you as agencies are going to have to take a look at what do you have in terms of all of your data, everything, and start thinking about the fact that I'm starting with 3 data sets as a requirement, but the message is clear. This stuff is going to need to be made available and useful to the public. This data, everything that you're producing, that's a giant order, right? So thinking about setting that bar in 2009, and we'll look at where we are now, was a huge step forward. And in 2009, the edict was clear that this was going to happen, right? The requirement was we're starting with 3, as we always do, pilot, pilot, pilot. It didn't talk about data.gov as a pilot, but in fact, that's what it ended up being. In 2013, the administration went one giant step further, issuing an executive order in this area that said, open and machine readable is now the default for all government information. This is the Open Government executive order, and this is essentially it, right? There's no going back now. We've given you 4 years to get your ducks in a row to figure out that this is the direction you're going to need to go in, and here now everything needs to be made available. So, that's a lot of precedent for one government to have, to lay a foundation to really set the tone and give the message that this is the direction, in fact, that we're going to go in. So with all of that, research results must have just opened up. I mean, agencies must have said, well, okay, the handwriting's on the wall. We've got to share our stuff. We've got to share articles. We've got to share data. This is the way things are going to move, right? So of course not so much, but some things did happen in those intervening years that are important. And I think they come from 2 directions. One was, given all that cumulative language and all the cumulative foundation that was laid, we ended up with a very clear policy focus for where we wanted to go. And I think 3 events that I'll highlight that were milestones that really set the tone for where we are now in terms of data and article sharing policies in the United States. It's taken about a decade for policies supporting this. I'm backwards, sorry. I might have deleted my slide, sorry. This is the byproduct, sorry, of doing four talks in 1 week. So the key policy focus is very simple. The language that these policies have coalesced around is taking all of the language from OMB A130 down through the executive orders and the different other pieces of policy that are in effect, and basically said this: taxpayers are entitled to access the results of research that their tax dollars have funded. And that is a statement that became sort of a rallying cry for moving from thinking about government information writ large to government data, to narrowing the focus to government research data and outputs in specific. And that was a very important statement, policy focus. And again, it's taken about a decade for policies that supported this statement to begin to be developed, adopted, and implemented in the arena that I think we're all most concerned about here. And a handful of key policies have really set the tone in the United States. There's no question. First and foremost, in 2008, after 3 years of being piloted, we'll hear this word a lot, and we're going to continue to hear this word a lot, especially in the data environment, the National Institutes of Health public access policy for its articles became federal statute. And it's a very simple policy that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Basically says if you take money from NIH to do research, you agree as a condition of that funding to make any article that reports on that research freely available to the public in NIH's online digital database, PubMed Central, no later than 1 year after it appears in a peer-reviewed journal. So it's essentially, for the first time, beginning to strike a balance between the world where Access by the public was paid only if you had a subscription or if you could find a way to get it through an institutional library or another mechanism, and making sure that the public got access to the articles reporting on research that their tax dollars had funded. It was a milestone event. And I think it was very interesting because Cameron talked about the readiness factor for policies. I go back and forth, right? Thinking, was it too soon or was it too late? In some senses, is it coming very late? I think if we waited for the community to be 100% ready for the NIH policy, we wouldn't have it today. And so on that hand, I'm glad that the policy's in place. On the other hand, if we had waited longer, would we have a 12-month embargo period, or would it be an immediate open access policy with full reuse rights? I don't know. We can argue that, and I think it's a very interesting conversation to have as we think about developing policies in the data realm, for example. But certainly the NIH policy set the bar, set the tone, and people spent a lot of time waiting and watching for it to either fail wildly or succeed wildly. And I think the good thing is that the NIH policy over the now 7 years that it's been in place has yielded 3.2 million articles in the database, with 1 million unique individuals accessing those articles every single day. So it was proof of concept of the demand for this information, that the public, in fact, really did care and really does want to get access to and use these articles. 1 million unique users access the database, but 2 million individual articles are actually downloaded each day. So it's not theoretical, like, oh, maybe I'm just browsing and taking a peek at this stuff. This is stuff that people really deeply care about. Huge landmark. At the same time, right, so this was a U.S. public funder, and I want to make sure that it's too much to try to cover the whole panoply of policy development worldwide. But at the same time, the Wellcome Trust in the United Kingdom, which is one of the largest private funders of biomedical research, issued a similar policy. It was a little bit stronger than the NIH policy in that it said, if you take money from the Wellcome, you have to make the articles that report on the results openly available. And you could do this either through depositing articles in a repository like PubMed Central, which it actually recommended doing, or publication in an open access journal, right? So moving the needle towards that immediate access and that full set of reuse rights that I think is the open access vision of a good policy. And the third policy that's been a landmark policy is a little bit softer, but it had an undeniable impact in the same way that the NIH policy and the Wellcome Trust policies had, but only for the research outputs in the sense of data. And in late 2010, the NSF announced that it was going to also make a condition of funding, and actually a condition of applying for funding, be that if you were going to come to the NSF and ask for money, as part of your grant application, you had to include a plan for data management, right? And that meant how people could access, share, and use your data over the long term, any data that was generated from that grant funding. And it's so fascinating to me that the NIH had a very soft requirement for grants that were over $500,000 that they didn't enforce. So it really didn't become the same kind of a landmark. But the NSF was really the first agency to do this on a large scale, to say data is so important and its future is so important that we're now going to say that in order for you to get funds from us, we're going to talk about data. It wasn't a hard requirement like the NIH policy saying, this is exactly what you need to do. It simply said, you have to give us your plan for how you're going to do it, recognizing some very important nuances in the policy environment in terms of disciplinary differences, of people's readiness in different disciplines to openly share data at different times, recognizing privacy, potential privacy concerns, security concerns, identity concerns, all the kinds of things that, and when you talk about individual researchers and say the words, open your data, will come back to you immediately in giant waves, right? Rightly so. But it set the bar that said, our intent is that we're gonna be sharing data. You're gonna help us set openly, but you're gonna help us set the parameters for what that looks like. So for quite a while, the policy focus was on, will these things work, right? Will the sky fall on the publishing industry because of the NIH policy and the Wellcome Trust policy? Will researchers on our campus start to revolt en masse because they don't like being told that we're going to have to open up access to our data at some point? What would happen? I think a lot of federal agencies will openly say, we sat back to see what the result was going to be before we took action. And we frankly really didn't want to take action in terms of moving things forward. But things changed again. And, I say what you will about the administration, they've been consistent on this issue. And in 2013, the White House Office of Science and Policy Technology, with a great deal of prodding from the advocacy community and the public, issued a directive that specifically addressed this issue. In February of 2013, the OSTP issued a memorandum to all federal agencies that produce scientific research and said, here's the deal. You are now required to develop plans for policies, but ultimately policies, to ensure public access to and use of research articles and data. And they specifically cited both the NIH policy and the NSF data management plan requirement as precedent for these are good things. These are avenues that are producing good results. We think that we've piloted them. We're seeing good things coming back. We want to expand this as a policy pathway to other federal agencies. So that was 2013, and I have fast in parentheses, fast forward 2 years to this year, because 2 years to me seemed like, there's me clawing. Could it be my clawing dance that I do, waiting impatiently for these policies to come out? That was horrible. And it's filmed.
And it's on film.
Yeah. I no longer have a job after this. That's okay. And that was for you, my staff, okay? So, all right. It seemed like an eternity, but for 2 years, it took the federal agencies quite some time, even with all the precedent and even with all the discussion and public consultation. People can be very impatient about policy development and policies moving forward. And I know when I first started advocating to Congress for the NIH policy, I'd go in and I'd say, but it's been 3 years. And I had a congressional staffer look at me and go, it's 5 to 7 years on average for when a law gets proposed to Congress to when any action is taken towards codification. So I don't know what you're whining to me about. And I thought at the time, oh my God, I'll be 40 by the time this happens or whatever. Well, so I'm way older than that now, and here's where we are. Policy development is an iterative process, and there's no two ways about it. And I think one of the things that I've come to respect is the fact that it's an iterative process, because there's no such thing as an easy win that doesn't have some consequence that you didn't foresee. And doing this in an iterative fashion takes a lot more resources, a lot more patience, but it also allows you more time to bring a larger community along and ultimately, I think, achieve more of the positive results without some of the negative offshoots. Maybe there's fat that we can trim out of some of the waiting time, but in general, the 2 years, I think, was reasonably well spent for these federal agencies. They had a lot to grapple with to try to decide how they would move forward. So the last segment of the talk, I really want to dig into where are we now, right? What are we seeing? What has been the net result of having the drivers well articulated and accepted by federal funders, of having precedent laid out for them, and of having these test cases in the article world and the data world that they can build on, right? Now they've also been told by the White House, you got to do this, right? This is, you are required to come up with policies. So this year we've seen, at the very least, some are in more final form than others, the draft policies for access to research articles and data, now from 12 of the 19 U.S. science agencies covered by the White House directive. And the vast majority of them have come out just over the last couple of months. The Department of Energy released their plan late last year. They were the first ones out of the gate, and the rest of the agencies have sort of been popping like little kernels of popcorn over the last few months. It's a lot of policies from a lot of agencies. This should also probably say the covering a lot of different scientific disciplines in a small period of time. It's a ton to try to digest and to sort through. But we've been trying to sort through what's come out so far. So what I thought I would do is highlight some of the key elements that we've seen first in the article environment and then in the data environment that bear watching. The article environment is definitely more homogeneous in terms of the agency approaches than the data environment. Science Magazine actually posted, I'm probably going to get in copyright trouble for doing this because it was a paid access article, a couple of weeks ago that says U.S. agencies fall in line on public access. But they did a pretty nice thing, right, which was to show some the major agencies that had released their plans to date, their policy plans from the NIH through NIST, the amount of federal funding that covers out of the $60 billion annually, and what their approach was. And you'll see that there's a pretty significant trend in terms of the direction that the agencies are choosing. The majority of the agencies, out of the 12, 10 of the agencies are using an NIH-like approach for compliance. In other words, they're requiring, if you take funding from that agency, any author of an article reporting on that funded research has to deposit the final peer-reviewed manuscript of that article into a database controlled by that federal agency. And in some cases, it's literally controlled by that federal agency, as in we are building a new repository like NOAA. In some cases, we're a government-controlled repository like PubMed Central. So it's very interesting to see agencies like NASA decide we're going to use PubMed Central, this existing federal repository, as our deposit solution, because the articles need to be accessible. They're absolutely successful in serving these things up. They have an ingest mechanism. They have a recording mechanism for IDing these papers. We'll be able to, know when they go in. We'll know who submits them. We'll be able to track them. We'll be able to track compliance. Never mind that it's PubMed Central and it will now have astronomical articles in it. I don't know. We might be faced with a name change for that, but that's a small price to pay. Very interesting that tends to be the approach. If we were to contrast this with some of the developments in other parts of the world in terms of approaches that people are taking, it's in line with many other countries, but there are some countries that have gone the completely different route. And that is to say, instead of requiring deposit in a public repository or a public or federally accessible repository, we're going to fund publication in open access journals, right? None of the U.S. agencies have said anything more explicit than grant funds, publications costs are allowable under current grant funds. None have said we're going to choose publication in open access journals and subsidize that as our major route for compliance. That said, two agencies, the Department of Energy and NSF, have indicated that they will be using requiring deposit into repositories of some sort. In the Department of Energy's case, it's a dark archive, but not serving up public access to those articles themselves. And you can see a little deviation on this link. Linked abstracts is the solution that they're using. They're using the publisher-based Chorus solution, which means they'll have a copy in an archive of their federally funded articles, but in order to see a copy, you as the member of the public will have to go directly to a publisher's website to see the article. You'll have the abstract, you'll have a link to that full text available through the agency, but you will have to go to the publisher's websites. And there's a lot of controversy over whether or not this approach should have in fact been sanctioned as an allowable approach by the White House, because part of the requirement of the White House directive was not just that these articles be available to the public to be read, but that they be able to be machine read, computed on, and analyzed. And it's very, very difficult to see how going to disparate publishers' websites is going to enable any kind of meaningful bulk download for computation or text mining or data mining. So I think there'll be some scrutiny on this approach by these two agencies coming up forward. And my guess would be that this is where we will see Congress getting back engaged in this process. The second thing that's of note in the policies that have come out is a really interesting discussion around embargo periods. For better or for worse, they all use the 12-month maximum embargo period as the default, but all of them, as was required by the White House directive, have put in some kind of mechanism to petition for that embargo period to change. And change was the operative word. Almost every single agency has a mechanism that allows you to, as a stakeholder, request a different embargo period based on how that embargo period will help the public or how the 12-month embargo period harms the public. So it's a very much a petition mechanism that can be used by agencies. It's set up to shorten the embargo period for all of the agencies except for one. So the requirement is you have to demonstrate using data how the public will be helped by shortening the embargo period, changing the embargo period, right? It's very difficult to imagine making a case the public's interest will be better served if I lock the article up for a longer period of time, right? It's much easier to imagine the scenario. The public's interest will be served if medical information gets out there faster, if agriculture, safe energy, if that information gets out there faster. The NIH has the most aggressively worded policy on this front. Actually, all of the HHS agencies, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, the FDA, they also allow the petitions to be brought forward not only by the public saying our interest will be served, but by their funded researchers when they apply for grants can say, I'm doing research in an area where I think the results need to be available on day one because the public's interest will be helped in this way. That's fascinating. The NSF went in the other direction, and it's the only agency that actually has this language, which says that the petitions can be brought to the agency to change the embargo period. And the first criteria is the impact on the publishing industry. Will it harm the publishers? And that's a completely different approach. So you can see, right, we've got 12 of the 19. We've got 11 going in one direction, one moving in another direction. In terms of homogenizing requirements to make compliance easier, I think we have some work to do, but we also have some places that are pretty naturally starting to fall out to show us the directions that we might want to work in. And the final thing about the final element that I wanted to point out, which is, I think, my biggest disappointment in looking at these plans is that the NIH policy was quite vague on reuse rights, right? The agency did not assert a worldwide non-exclusive distribution license under its federal purpose license, but basically said it's up to authors to deal with copyright, right? We can serve up the articles, but it's basically only the uses that are allowed under fair use that are enabled in our databases. And in all of the policies, the rights, let me rephrase that. In none of the policies has the reuse rights issue been addressed any more robustly than that. And that's not great. However, what it's been doing as people on campus have been seeing it, they're going, this is ridiculous. This is leaving a big empty hole. I think we need to assert at least the uses that we want for our campuses into this process. And we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence on campuses interested in developing large-scale author rights campaigns and author retention policies for campuses. And I wouldn't be surprised if because compliance becomes so difficult and understanding what you can and can't do in these disparate federal databases becomes so difficult that our campuses don't stand up and say, all right, there's actually a place where we can take care of it if the federal government won't. And that's for our campuses to assert, this is the rights that we have to articles that are coming out of our campuses. So I think it's I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. It's not a happy element in the policies, but I do think that there are some things that we can do to combat that. In terms of data, it's clear that unlike the article policy development, this isn't it's an evolutionary process. Every single agency basically said, this is our first pass at what we think our data policies should look like, but we're going to be talking to the community and drafting and redrafting these policies in response to the community's feedback. That said, they have all uniformly adopted the NSF's approach of requiring data management plans to set the default mode to open in the data environment. That's the trigger for them. And that, I think, is fantastic because they are also looking at standardizing across federal agencies, potentially the elements that are required in data management plans. We have a lot of work to do on that front, but it is an element that I think will be in the works. And doing this at the proposal stage really sends a strong message that says, this isn't something that we take care of later. It's something we take care of before we issue you your funds. The expectation is for sharing unless you can provide us with rationale why your data cannot or should be made openly accessible. The third piece, it says two, the third piece is there's a very strong push, and I think it's about to get stronger, supporting the reproducibility of the results reported on in federal articles. A lot of the agencies included language. None have said we're going to require it, but many have said we are exploring the possibility of actually requiring that the data underlying articles that report on federal research may be required to be made available the day the article is published, which would be an incredibly strong statement to say at least that subset of data that you need to validate the article or reproduce its results is made available on day one. That's, I think, going to be very controversial as it goes forward, but it is language that shows up in almost all of the plans. Almost all of the plans also are uniform in the fact that they're not saying the federal government is going to create a whole new set of repositories to house data. There's very much an emphasis on looking to the community for using well-established public repositories in the private sector, in the cloud, in university campuses. It is there's no agency that said we're going to create a new data depository for federal information or federal research data, which is kind of fascinating. Another requirement that is almost uniform across agencies is this requirement to know thy data. Every agency has indicated that it will, for the first time, generate an inventory of the research data that it produces, which seems kind of rudimentary, but which is actually quite, that hasn't been done. And they will be developing forward-facing catalogues and indexes of their available research data for the first time. And there's, I think, 3 more, and then I'm going to close here. I already mentioned standards that these will be developed. All of the plans indicate that developing standards across data sets, everything from the components of data management plans to archiving standards to metadata standards is on the table. You can see why it's not a one-and-done policy development program, right? With all of these open questions, the standards issue alone is going to take several iterations and a lot of work among the agencies and the communities that they serve and between the agencies and among the agencies themselves. This is my favorite thing of all. In the HHS plan that covers, again, 5 agencies from NIH to the CDC to the FDA and beyond, they meant that the plan calls for exploring ways that data, research data, can be consistently cited and attributed. And the language in this plan actually says that the goal of doing this is to advance data as a legitimate form of scholarship. And I think it's fantastic when we get a signal from 5 federal agencies that one of the things that we want to get out of making research data more openly accessible is a way for people to be appropriately credited for producing good data and for doing work on good data. And that's hugely exciting, a hugely exciting outcome of this. And the last 2 elements that have come out are, I would label, we're all in this together, parts 1 and part 2. Every single agency says we're going to figure out the next iteration of what our policy looks like by piloting with the community, by doing public-private pilots, by piloting with the research universities, by piloting. And additionally, they want to work together. There's a notion that's floating around that's mentioned in, it's 11 of the 12 agencies, sorry, that 13 is a mistake, releasing plans to date of establishing and developing a data commons together. And the data commons is really a notion of not a physical space where everybody will put their data, but of the federal agencies working together to develop best practices, good behaviors. How do you how do you act when you put your data in the commons, when you're sharing data in the open? And I think it's a great sign that 11 of the 12 agencies have said, we want to talk about not only making our data open, but what it will mean to work with data in an open environment. So I'm going to stop there. I think it's a lot of information to go through all at one time, but I hope it gives you the sense that this is a living and breathing process that's got a long and rich history, a lot of precedent. We have a lot of work to do to move forward, but I would be surprised now with the groundwork that's been laid. It's going to be very difficult to try to undo this and to go back to thinking about closed as the default rather than open as the default. So I'll stop there and say thanks.
I was a federal government scientist for a very long time,
Did you know I was talking to you the whole time? Like I literally was looking at you the entire
but
time.
I haven't been for several years. What difference do you think the Republican Congress is going to make in these trends, or a Republican president might make?
So it's fascinating that you asked me this question. Yesterday, my talk was to the Association of Research Libraries about an initiative that Spark is running right now, where we're talking to every single one of the presumptive Republican presidential candidates about these issues. And we're trying to get them to adopt them as campaign platform issues. The shocking preliminary result that I can share after having met with chiefs of staff and strategists for Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Jeb Bush, Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, to name the majority of them, as well as some of the Republican governors, is that they're very open to this idea. They view making access to research information open as a way to open up a layer of information that can serve as the lifeblood for job creation for a new American middle class. They see coder jobs, they see maker jobs, they see jobs. It's been very interesting to see. They don't
And the
believe
Congress?
Congress, a similar philosophical reception, with the caveat that the reason we're talking to presidential candidates is Congress isn't doing very much. So I wouldn't look at Congress for leadership just yet on this, but I also wouldn't look at them to block.